70% of young people feel eco-anxious. Now, for a lot of young people, this will probably come as no surprise, but I know when we share this statistic for some of the adults in the room, it can come as a little bit of a shock. But we recognize that the climate crisis is already upon us. We only need to look as far as the droughts that have been taking place across Europe through to the flooding in Pakistan that has displaced over 30 million people. We know that climate collapse is happening, and of course, climate science tells us that we have a smaller and smaller window to take massive transformative action. As a generation, we have inherited this crisis. And as a generation, we see how interconnected all of these crises are, from the fight for social justice and Black Lives Matter, through to gender equity, through to ecosystem collapse and climate denial. We see how all of these problems are deeply interconnected. Now, many young people today have actually given up hope in the possibility of progress. We see a deep disillusionment that is taking hold, particularly in my generation. And recent research that we conducted with 10,000 young people in 10 countries found that 56% of those young people believe that humanity is doomed. As we can see, we are facing not only a climate crisis, but a mental health crisis too. And to share some of the stories of the young people we've worked with, Katrina in Australia told us, "I feel constant anxiety that the climate is seriously worsening, but there seems to be almost nothing you can do about it as an individual, and so many people don't seem to care." Yashri in India told us, "I don't want to have children because I don't know what kind of world I'll be bringing them into." Now, Yashri has direct lived experience of the climate crisis in India, but we've heard this echoed in so many young people, particularly young women that we've worked with around the world. I've sat down with 12 and 13-year-old girls in the classroom who've told me they already have decided that they don't want to have children for this very reason. Anna from the USA shared the depth that eco-anxiety can be experienced in. She shared, "I've experienced eco-anxiety since I was an adolescent and have experienced suicidal ideology as well as intense anxiety as a result." For me, eco-anxiety and the feeling of powerlessness was something that I always tried to hold at bay. I declared myself an activist at the age of 11 at the dinner table back home in Australia. I said to my dad that my first act was to become a vegetarian, which he was horrified by because he's French and a chef. So he took that as a rejection of everything he stood for. But from that time on, for me, I felt that I needed to cling on to feelings of optimism and hope, because I worried that if I opened the door to some of the feelings shared here, that I would fall into a well and I would never come out again. And yet, in November of 2019, I had no choice but to fall into that well. Some of you might recall the fires back home in Australia. But every day I woke up crying. I would cry in the shower. I would cry on my way to work. I would cry in the middle of meetings, much to the dismay of polite British society. And I was going through grief because every time I opened my phone, I saw the apocalyptic images of my country on fire. I read the headlines that told us that 2 billion animals had been incinerated in this inferno. I went on Instagram and saw videos sent by friends that showed them standing on the roofs of their homes, holding hoses, trying to keep back the flames and embers. Growing up in a bubble of relative climate privilege, the climate crisis was something that I read about in articles and watched in documentaries. And yet for the first time, I had a glimpse of what it was to see the loss of my culture, my country, to see the very places that had made me an environmentalist go up in flames. But against the backdrop of this eco-anxiety, it is no wonder why so many young people not only feel frustrated and angry, but feel disillusioned. It's no wonder why so many young people are losing hope. Because we see a completely inadequate response to this emergency. Oftentimes, the climate crisis is compared to a war. But in war times, leaders mobilize. They put huge resource into responding to the threat at large. Yet, as we know with the climate crisis, we're continually met with incremental